Thorne stood grinning at his wife. "We'll have time for another quick round," she said. She looked coolly at Lydia. "The wine can stand a bit more chilling." The two women smiled at each other brightly. Thorne, mixing the martinis, began to hum, "I can do anything better than you. Anything you can do, I can do better." Over the soup, Stanton wrenched the talk away from acting by launching into a vehement attack on Rube Marquand's record of 19 straight victories on the mound, attributing the old pitcher's success to the dead baseball of his period. This led into an argument with Thorne as to the exact date of the Ershker-Kador 26-inning pitching duel, during which the ladies discovered that they saw precisely eye to eye in the case of an enormous mutual friend who had let herself go with shocking results, not only in girth but in intelligence. They were both reminded in the same instant of their common incredulity upon encountering a certain blonde whose youth and beauty had been utterly destroyed in less than a year of marriage. The talk joined when the women attacked and the men defended the blonde's husband, a heel, a swell guy, a lush, a drinker of incomparable moderation. It was all amiable enough. Thorne repeated a witticism about marriage that Anne had heard a dozen times, but she laughed merrily with the others. Over the coffee and brandy in the living room, the men revealed their secret knowledge of what was going on in the mind of Bulganin, and pointed out how any child could have avoided the blunders of Eden and Mollet. The women, meanwhile, were exchanging candid praises of each other's subtlety of taste in flower arrangement, working in a fleeting counterpoint of small self-deprecations. Thorne gave one ear to Stanton's fluent breakdown of the first 10 ballots that would be cast at the 1960 National Conventions. With the other ear, he sounded the temper of the women, the strength of whose mutual esteem he decided to test with further applications of brandy. "It'll be a flurry, all right, but it won't be a trend," Stanton said. Thorne had lost the thread of his guest's argument. "The Kennedy bid," Stanton explained. "It'll be like one of those wide end runs that get everybody in the stands to yelling but don't go anywhere." The women did not protest when Thorne refilled their glasses. They were now shrewdly exploring the possibility that the enormous woman's vapid state and slow mental activity might be the result in part of persistent overdoses of barbiturates. "My dear," Thorne said mockingly, grinning at each one in turn, "if I were married to that man, I should certainly take—" "Shut up," said Anne. Although the conversation took a dozen different turns, Thorne was careful not to let the mouse of Rosalind get too far away from the cat of his stubborn intention. He filled 4 or 5 lulls in the talk with interested questions. How many lines of the play, if any, could they remember? Had there been reviews? Had they saved the programs? How large were their audiences? Why had neither of the girls gone in seriously for a stage career when so many inconsiderable talents had achieved undeserved success? Anne and Lydia waved it all away with little laughs and, "Oh, for heaven's sake," and "I haven't got the faintest idea." But Thorne thought he saw the embers of pride glow again in the ashes of old dreams. Between 11 o'clock and midnight, Stanton made several abortive moves to go, but he finally gave up. 1 o'clock found him sitting uncomfortably in his chair with the strained expression of a man who has resigned himself to a sleepless night in a hotel taken over by a convention of surgeons. Furthermore, his attempts to rise and his repeated "Lydia, dear," had had the disturbing effect of bringing out, one after another, George Thorne's imitations of W.C. Fields, Ed Wynn, Al Jolson, Peter Lorre, and Henry Hull as Jeter Lester. During these sporadic performances, the smooth surface of Anne Thorne's dutiful attention had developed cracks obvious to her husband's trained eye, which had also discerned Lydia Stanton's polite amusement changing to brave tolerance and deteriorating at last into the restlessness of posture and precise dreaminess of eye that Thorne had been so energetically working to produce. During it all, Thorne had managed to keep the highball glasses constantly refreshed, and the success of this phase of his strategy showed in a glowing relaxation of manner, except in the case of Stanton, and a tendency in the women to use each other's name in every sentence. "What do you say we run off my Chevalier recording?" Thorne said suddenly. "He really does do a very good imitation of Chevalier, Lydia," Anne said. We had about 6 of us here one night after a big party broke up, Thorne explained. Everybody read or recited something into the recorder mic. I remember Tom Sessions read an editorial from the Phi-Psi Shield. I had one lying around. Well, everybody shut off his mouth except Dot Gardner and Julia Reed. Oh, no, indeed. Not for them. You wouldn't catch them making a fool of themselves. Of course, at 3 o'clock, they elbowed the other hambos aside and took over the mic. Stanton cleared his throat. Lydia, dear, he said. It was really too wonderful, Lydia, Anne said, laughing. Dot read that Cornford poem, Autumn Morning in Cambridge, Thorne said. I had a first edition lying around. And what was it Julia did, George? Anne giggled. Lizette Woodworth Reese's As God Is My Judge, Tears. Oh, no, Lydia shouted. That tiny voice, Anne, coming out of that enormous hulk? It was Rich, Thorne said. What the hell it is, Rich? The goddamn thing is preserved for lucky people of the future, digging around in the atomic rubble. Let's play it. My Chevalier imitation, a perfect Jim, is thrown in for good measure. Lydia, Stanton said. It's in the library. The recorder is in the library, Thorne said. Come on, Fred. Lydia took his arm, smiled, and whispered savagely, For God's sake, keep your eyes open. Bring your drink, Fred, Thorne said. Let me put some more ice in it. No, thanks, said Stanton. It's fine. He saw first the small microphone on the table in the library, and his reluctant eyes followed the cord attached to it as if it were a lighted fuse glittering toward the ominous box at the other end. I think you better get Herbert to do it, George, Anne said, or maybe Fred could. Her husband scowled. For God's sake, Anne, I've worked this thing 100 times. I know, she said, with the look of a woman riding in a car driven by a little boy. It's a perfectly wonderful-looking thing, Lydia said. Was it terribly expensive? Around $250, Thorne said. We're in luck. That spool's on here now. Stanton was gazing with tidy disapproval at the reproduction of Dufy's Marne over the fireplace. Are you sure you can make it go without breaking it? Anne asked. Thorne did not look at her. Here we go, he yelled. The machine began to hum, low and menacingly. There was a loud electric whine, a sudden roar, and George's recorded voice bawled from the machine. Okay, Herbert, is it okay? Yes, sir. You can go ahead, sir, the butler's voice bellowed. Turn down the volume, for the love of heaven. Turn it down, Anne screamed. Thorne succeeded at last in finding the knob that controlled the volume. They listened while the solemn voice of Tom Sessions turgidly read an editorial from the Phi-Psi Shield entitled The Meaning of Fraternity in Wartime. Lydia began to squirm in her chair. She turned on a frosty smile when the voice of her host began a burlesque of Chevalier, explaining in English the meaning of Auprès de ma blonde. During this performance, Thorne modestly left the room, carrying the 4 highball glasses. He spiked the women's drinks, shooting in only 2 squirts of soda. He came back in time to hear the voice of Dorothy Gardner reciting in a curiously uneven mixture of eloquence and uncertainty the Cornford lyric. Sounds like a crippled halfback running through a broken field, Thorne said. Shh, said Lydia. She put her tongue out at the first taste of the powerful highball. Go get that seltzer bottle, Anne commanded. Thorne grinned and went out to the bar. Don't miss this coming now, Anne cried. The voice of Julia Reed, exalted abnormally low, got by, A rose choked in the grass, and then died. There was a long pause. What the hell comes next? The Dessous demanded. A dim voice that had spoken far from the microphone prompted her. The voice of the unseen, elated lady then went on to finish Miss Reese's sonnet in a tone of almost sepulchral dignity. I really think, Lydia, Stanton said. Anne took the seltzer bottle from Thorne and diluted Lydia's drink and her own. Turn it off, she said. The reel was still unwinding, but no voices came from it. Wait a second, Thorne said. Don't you want to hear Mark and Ken sing I Had a Dream, Dear? 2 male voices began a ragged rendition of the old song in a key too low for them. Anne went over and shut off the machine. Well, sir, that was very fine, Stanton proclaimed loudly. He stood up. I'm going to put on a new spool for the gals, Thorne said. Sit down, Fred. Anne and Lydia protested quickly, but not, Thorne's ear told him, with sharpness or finality. There was a hint of excitement, an unmistakable eagerness in their chimed, "Oh, no, you're not." "I can put on a new one faster than you can say Sarah Bernhardt," he said. "I've never heard my own voice," Lydia said. "They say you never recognize your own voice." "It's because you hear the sound internally inside your mouth," Anne explained. "It's really fascinating." "As You Like It is right there on the second shelf, Volume 2, The Collected Comedies," Thorne said. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Anne squealed. "I haven't looked at that damn play for 20 years. Lydia quietly finished her drink. "There we are," Thorne said, stepping back and scowling at the sound mirror. "All ready to shoot. Here, I'll get the book." Stanton, eyes closed, hands gripping his chair arms, seemed to be awaiting the impact of a dentist's drill. The women made little arrangements of their hair and skirts. Thorne flipped through the pages of the Shakespeare volume. "May the best Rosalind win," he grinned. "How about this?" Stanton tightened his grip on the chair. Anne examined her wedding ring. Lydia studied the floor. "A lean cheek, which you have not, a blue eye and sunken, which you have not, an unquestionable spirit, which you have not." "For heaven's sake, George, read it straight," Anne broke in. "Don't act it." "A beard neglected, which you have not, but I pardon you for that, for simply your having in beard is a younger brother's revenue. Then your hose should be ungartered, your bonnet unbanded, your sleeve unbuttoned, your shoe untied, and everything about you demonstrating a careless desolation. But you are no such man, you are rather point device in your accoutrements, as loving yourself than seeming the lover of any other." "That awful speech," Anne said. "I hated it." "You don't happen to have a copy of Candida?" Lydia asked. "No fair," Thorne said. "Anne never did Candida." "How about this passage? 'Yes, one, and in this manner. He was to imagine me his love, his mistress, and I set him every day to woo me, at which time would I, being but a moonish youth, grieve, be effeminate, changeful, longing and liking, proud, fantastical, apish, shallow, inconstant, full of tears, full of smiles, for every passion something, and for no passion truly anything, as boys and women are for the most part cattle of this color, would now like him, now loathe him, then entertain him, then forswear him, now weep for him, then spit at him, that I drave my suitor from his mad humor of love to a living humor of madness, which was to forswear the full stream of the world and to live in a nook merely monastic, and thus I cured him. And this way will I take upon me to wash your liver as clean as a sound sheep's heart, that there shall not be one spot of love in't." "Wouldn't you just know a man wrote that?" Anne lifted her hands hopelessly. "It has to be thrown away, you know, parts of that speech," Lydia sighed, as if it were impossible to explain how to attack this particular passage. "Oh, let's do it and get it over with, Lydia," Anne said. "Do you want to go first?" "You go ahead, darling." Lydia waved at Thorne, and he handed his wife the book, pointing at the selected speech. Anne's eyebrows went up when she looked at the page. "The type is funny," she announced. "Read it over a couple of times while I fix a nightcap." Thorne gathered up all the glasses. "Just one sip," Anne said, when a few minutes later he brought in the fresh highballs. "Ready?" asked Thorne. "Roll 'em," she said. The machine began to hum. Anne leaned toward the microphone on the edge of the table. Then she leaned back with a shy little run of laughter. "Heavens, I can't do it in front of people!" Her girlish ripple coagulated when she caught the professional glint of amusement in Lydia's eye. "All right, George," Anne said. "Start the damn thing." She seemed to her watchful husband to lunge suddenly like an unwary boxer. She gave the speech at the very beginning a brisk blow from which it never recovered. The swiftness of her attack was too much for the old lines, and although she slowed down halfway through, the passage could not regain its balance. It faded, brightened unexpectedly, faded again, and collapsed with a dignified whisper at the end. Thorne repressed a wild impulse to jump over and raise his wife's right hand. Stanton applauded loudly, and all three of her audience called out, "Fine and wonderful!" Anne showed charming dismay. "Mercy, I was horrible," she wailed. "You'll murder me, Lydia." "You were perfectly fine," Lydia said. "Here we go, Lydia," Thorne shouted. "Your time has come." "Oh, dear, I hate to follow Anne," Lydia almost whispered. She made an elaborate rite of lifting her highball glass and taking a final sip, and then began to read. Fred Stanton turned a slow, wondering head toward the source of a voice he had never heard before. It was low, resonant, and strange. Closing his eyes and pursuing his image of the prize ring, Thorne saw Lydia circle cautiously about the lines, waiting for an opening. She did not find one. Her slow, monotonous tactics went on to the end. It reminded Thorne of the first few rounds of the second Lewis-Kahn fight. Thorne led the loud applause this time. Anne shrieked with delight. Stanton said, "Well, well, well," and Lydia sat back, covered her eyes with her hand, and shook her head despondently, like a frustrated prima donna whose trunks have gone astray in a small town. "Well, well, well," Stanton said again. He got to his feet. "Sit down, Fred," Thorne said. "We got to play it back." Worrying the machine as if it were a tangled fishing line, he finally made the necessary shifts and adjustments. "Quiet, here we go," he yelled. The volume was stepped up as high as it would go. "I set him every day to woo me," Anne howled from the machine. Thorne made a wild leap and cut the volume down. "God damn it," Anne said, glaring at him. Then, "Oh, no," she whispered, her startled stare disowning the unfamiliar voice that mocked her from the sound mirror. Stanton started to applaud at the end, but Thorne cut him off with, "Shh, here comes Lydia," and moved quickly to the recorder, and as if in an innocent effort to ensure perfection of reproduction, shot up the volume on Lydia's opening line so that she also bawled it. He turned it down instantly. "Well," Lydia said, "then that's not me." "Perfect," Stanton said. Everybody stared fixedly at the machine. When it was over, Stanton broke through the chatter with a determined, very fine, we must go, Lydia." "Can't I sell a nightcap? One nightcap," Thorne kept saying, but the others moved out of the library, Stanton firmly leading the way. 5 minutes later, a high tide of gaiety flooded the front hallway and bore out into the night a bright flotsam of pledge and promise, praise and disclaimer, regrets at parting and wonder at the swiftness of time. The Stantons drove in silence until they were a good 300 yards from the house. "Well," Lydia sighed with tired satisfaction, ran up the window, and settled back comfortably. "I've heard some strange performances in my life, but I never heard anything like that. I sat there biting my lip." She made a Jane Cowell gesture. "Yeah," Stanton said. "That silly little sing-song voice," she went on. "Why, she can barely read. And the way she kept batting her eyes, trying to look cute and appealing." "She doesn't drink very well," Stanton said. "She had an awful lot to drink." Lydia laughed harshly. "Invitation of Chevalier? I thought I would scream. I really thought I would scream." "What was that?" Stanton asked. "Oh, you didn't get it, of course, sitting there with your eyes closed, a million miles away. You didn't say one word, one single solitary word, from 10 o'clock until we left that house, except 'Lydia dear, Lydia dear, Lydia dear,' until I thought I would go out of my mind." "Ah," Stanton said. He reached for the pack of cigarettes in his pocket. "I'll light it for you. Keep your hands on the wheel." "Light the match toward you," he said. "Don't strike it away from you. You always strike it away from you." She wasted 3 matches, striking them away from her. "Slow down," she said. He stopped the car. "I'll light it," he told her. "That guy always gets me down. He won't sit still and he won't stop talking, yammering all over the place. At least he stays awake. At least he knows what's going on." "Anyway, you were wonderful," Stanton said quickly. "You made Anne look like an amateur. You were marvelous." She sighed a hopeless little sigh. "Well, you either have talent, Fred, or you haven't. She must have been the only girl in that Wyoming school or whatever it was. You went past that turn again." Stanton stopped the car and began to back up. "What was that goddamn fan like?" he asked. It was awful, she told him. And if she said George got it for me in Rome once, she said it 50 times. George obviously got it from some Italian street peddler for a few francs. 18th century, my foot. They drove a while in silence. Lira, Stanton said. Lydia sniffed. I doubt it, she said. Back in their living room, the Thorns were having a short nightcap. I wish the hell you wouldn't always act as if I couldn't make anything work, Thorne said. I can do more with my feet than that big dolt can do with his hands. Better let Fred do it, George. Better get Herbert to do it. For God's sake, lay off, will you? I made the thing work. I always make it work. Shut up, George, and give me some more ice, Anne said. The thing that really got me, though, was that horrible affectation. She sounded like a backward child just learning to read. She paused and put on a frown that her husband recognized. She wore it when she was hunting for a grievance. She found one. If you can make it work so well, why did you turn it up so high people could hear me yelling for 3 blocks? I cut it down right away, didn't I? And I made her yell even louder. Anne laughed. That was wonderful. That was really wonderful, George. At your service, Thorne bowed. Come on, let's go with unlighted candle, dark to bed. The light that breaks through yonder eastern window is not the setting sun, my pet. They got up and Thorne turned out the lights. Does he know anything? Has he got a brain in his head? She demanded. Fred? God, no. He has the mind of a turtle. If he'd only yawn and get it over with instead of working his mouth that way. Halfway up the stairs, Anne turned suddenly. Thorne stopped and looked up at her. Do you know the most ghastly thing about her, she asked? That moo-cow voice? No, heaven knows that's bad enough. But can you possibly imagine her in doublet and hose? Those legs, George, those legs! Thorne jumped a step, caught up with her, and they went the rest of the way to their bedroom, arm in arm. The French Far West. In one of the many interesting essays that make up his book called Abinger Harvest, Mr. E.M. Forrester, discussing what he sees when he is reluctantly dragged to the movies in London, has set down a sentence that fascinates me. It is, American women shoot the hippopotamus with eyebrows made of platinum. I have given that remarkable sentence a great deal of study, but I still do not know whether Mr. Forrester means that American women have platinum eyebrows, or that the hippopotamus has platinum eyebrows, or that the American women shoot platinum eyebrows into the hippopotamus. At any rate, it faintly stirred in my mind a dim train of elusive memories which were brightened up suddenly and brought into sharp focus for me when, one night, I went to see The Plainsman, a hard-riding, fast-shooting movie dealing with warfare in the Far West back in the bloody 70s. I knew then what Mr. Forster's curious and tantalizing sentence reminded me of. It was like nothing in the world so much as certain sentences which appeared in a group of French paperback dime, or rather 25-centime, novels that I collected a dozen years ago in France. The Plainsman brought up these old pulp thrillers in all clarity for me because, like that movie, they dealt mainly with the stupendous activities of Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok. But in them were a unique fantasy, a special inventiveness, and an imaginative abandon beside which the movie treatment of the two heroes pales, as the saying goes, into nothing. In the moving from one apartment to another some years ago, I somehow lost my priceless collection of Contes Héroïques du Far West. But happily, I find that a great many of the deathless adventures of the French Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok remain in my memory. I hope that I shall recall them for anodyne, when, with eyes too dim to read, I pluck finally at the counterpane. In the first place, it should perhaps be said that in the 1890s, the American dime novel hero who appears to have been most popular with the French youth and adult, given to such literature, was Nick Carter. You will find somewhere in one of John L. Stoddard's published lectures, there used to be a set in almost every Ohio bookcase, an anecdote about how an American tourist set upon by Apache in a dark rue in Paris in the 90s, caused them to scatter in terror merely by shouting, "Je suis Nick Carter." But at the turn of the century, or shortly thereafter, Buffalo Bill became the favorite. Whether he still is or not, I don't know. Perhaps Al Capone or John Dillinger has taken his place. 12 years ago, however, he was going great guns, or perhaps I should say great dynamite, for one of the things I most clearly remember about the Buffalo Bill of the French authors was that he always carried with him sticks of dynamite, which, when he was in a particularly tough spot, that is, surrounded by more than 2,000 Indians, he hurled into their midst, destroying them by the hundred. Many of the most inspired paperbacks that I picked up in my quest were used ones I found in those little stalls along the Seine. It was there, for instance, that I came across one of my favorites, Les Aventures du Wild Bill dans le Far West. Wild Bill Hickok was, in this wonderful and beautiful tale, an even more prodigious manipulator of the six-gun than he seems to have been in real life, which, as you must know, is saying a great deal. He frequently mowed down 100 or 200 Indians in a few minutes with his redoubtable pistol. The French author of this masterpiece, for some mysterious but delightful reason, referred to Hickok sometimes as Wild Bill and sometimes as Wild Bird. "Bonjour, Wild Bill," his friend Buffalo Bill often said to him when they met, only to shout a moment later, "Regarde, Wild Bird, les peaux rouges." The two heroes spent a great deal of their time, as in The Plainsman, helping each other out of dreadful situations. Once, for example, while hunting Seminoles in Florida, Buffalo Bill fell into a tiger trap that had been set for him by the Indians. He stepped onto what turned out to be sticks covered with grass and plunged to the bottom of a deep pit. At this point, our author wrote, "Mercy me," s'écria Buffalo Bill. The great scout was rescued, of course, by none other than Wild Bill, or Bird, who, emerging from the forest to see his old comrade in distress, could only exclaim, "My word!" It was, I believe, in another volume that one of the most interesting characters in all French fiction of the Far West appeared, a certain Major Preston, alias Preton, alias Preslin. The paperbacks rarely spelled anyone's name twice in succession the same way. This hero, we were told, when he was introduced, had distinguished himself in the Civil War by capturing Pittsburgh, a feat which makes Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania seem mere child's play. Major Preton, I always preferred that alias, had come out west to fight the Indians with cannon, since he believed it absurd that nobody had thought to blow them off the face of the earth with cannon before. How he made out with his artillery against the forest skulkers I have forgotten, but I have an indelible memory of a certain close escape that Buffalo Bill had in this same book. It seems that, through an oversight, he had set out on a scouting trip without his dynamite. He also carried, by the way, cheroots and a flashlight, and hence, when he stumbled upon a huge band of redskins, he had to ride as fast as he could for the nearest fort. He made it just in time. Buffalo Bill, ran the story, clattered across the drawbridge and into the fort just ahead of the Indians, who, unable to stop in time, plunged into the moat and were drowned. It may have been in this same tale that Buffalo Bill was once so hard-pressed that he had to send for Wild Bird to help him out. Usually, when one was in trouble, the other showed up by a kind of instinct. But this time, Wild Bird was nowhere to be found. It was a long time, in fact, before his whereabouts were discovered. You will never guess where he was. He was taking the baths at Atlantic City under orders of his physician. But he came riding across the country in one day to Buffalo Bill's side, and all was well. Major Preton, it sticks in my mind, got bored with the service in the Western hotels and went back to Philadelphia. Philadelphia appears to have been the capital city of the United States at this time. The Indians in all these tales, and this is probably what gave Major Preton his great idea, were seldom seen as individuals or in pairs or small groups, but prowled about in well-ordered columns of squads. I recall, however, one drawing, the paperbacks were copiously illustrated, which showed two peaux rouges leaping upon and capturing a scout who had wandered too far from his drawbridge one night. The picture represented one of the Indians as smilingly taunting his captive, and the caption read, "Vous vous promenez très tard ce soir, mon vieux." This remained my favorite line until I saw one night in Paris an old W.S. Hart movie called Le Roi du Far West, in which Hart, insulted by a drunken ruffian, turned upon him and said in his grim, laconic way, "Et puis après?" I first became interested in the French tales of the Far West when one winter in Nice, a French youngster of 15, who had turned out devoted all his spending money to them, asked me if I had ever seen A Wishton Wish. This meant nothing to me, and I asked him where he had heard about the Wishton Wish. He showed me a Far West paperback he was reading. There was a passage in it which recounted an adventure of Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill, during the course of which Buffalo Bill signaled to Wild Bird in the voice of the Wishton Wish. Said the author in a parenthesis, which at that time gave me as much trouble as Mr. Forster's sentence about the platinum eyebrows does now, the Wishton Wish was seldom heard west of Philadelphia. It was some time, indeed it was not until I got back to America before I traced the Wishton Wish to its lair, and in so doing discovered the influence of James Fenimore Cooper on all those French writers of Far West tales. Cooper, in his novels, frequently mentioned the Wishton Wish, which was a Caddoan Indian name for the prairie dog. Cooper erroneously applied it to the whippoorwill. An animal called the wapiti also figured occasionally in the French stories, and this turned out to be the wapiti, or American elk, also mentioned in Cooper's tales. The French writer's parenthetical note on the habitat of the Wishton Wish only added to the delightful confusion and inaccuracy which threaded these wondrous stories. There were in my lost and lamented collection 100 other fine things which I have forgotten, but there is one that will forever remain with me. It occurred in a book in which, as I remember it, Billy the Kid, alias Billy the Boy, was the central figure. At any rate, 2 strangers had turned up in a small western town, and their actions had aroused the suspicions of a group of respectable citizens, who forthwith called on the sheriff to complain about the newcomers. The sheriff listened gravely for a while, got up and buckled on his gun belt, and said, "Alors, je vais demander ces cartes d'identité." There are few things in any literature that have ever given me a greater thrill than coming across that line. A Friend to Alexander. "I have taken to dreaming about Aaron Burr every night," Andrews said. "What for?" said Mrs. Andrews. "How do I know what for?" Andrews snarled. "What for, the woman says." Mrs. Andrews did not flare up. She simply looked at her husband as he lay on the chaise longue in her bedroom, in his heavy blue dressing gown, smoking a cigarette. Although he had just got out of bed, he looked haggard and tired. He kept biting his lower lip between puffs. Aaron Burr is a funny person to be dreaming about nowadays. I mean, with all the countries in the world threatening each other. I wish you would go and see Dr. Fox, said Mrs. Andrews, taking her thumb from between the pages of her mystery novel and tossing the book toward the foot of her bed. She sat up straighter against her pillow. "Maybe Haliver oil or B1 is what you need," she said. "B1 does wonders for people. I don't see why you see him in your dreams. Where do you see him?" "Oh, places. In Washington Square or Bowling Green or on Broadway. I'll be talking to a woman in a Victoria, a woman holding a white lace parasol, and suddenly there will be Burr, bowing and smiling and smelling like a carnation, telling his stories about France and getting off his insults." Mrs. Andrews lighted a cigarette, although she rarely smoked until after lunch. "Who is the woman in the Victoria?" she asked. "What? How do I know? You know about people in dreams, don't you? They are nobody at all or everybody." "You see Aaron Burr plainly enough, though. I mean, he isn't nobody or everybody." All right, said Andrews. "You have me there. But I don't know who the woman is, and I don't care. Maybe it's Madame Jumel or Mittens Willett or a girl I knew in high school. That's not important." "Who is Mittens Willett?" asked Mrs. Andrews. She was a famous New York actress in her day, 50 years ago or so. She's buried in an old cemetery on 2nd Avenue. That's very sad, said Mrs. Andrews. Why is it? Demanded Andrews, who was now pacing up and down the deep red carpet. I mean, she probably died young, said Mrs. Andrews. Almost all women did in those days. Andrews ignored her and walked over to a window and looked out at a neat, bleak street in the 50s. He's a vile, cynical cad, said Andrews, suddenly turning away from the window. I was standing talking to Alexander Hamilton when Burr stepped up and slapped him in the face. When I looked at Hamilton, who do you suppose he was? I don't know, said Mrs. Andrews. Who was he? He was my brother, the one I've told you about, the one who was killed by that drunkard in the cemetery. Mrs. Andrews had never got that story straight, and she didn't want to go into it again now. The facts in the tragic case and her way of getting them mixed up always drove Andrews into a white-faced fury. I don't think we ought to dwell on your nightmare, said Mrs. Andrews. I think we ought to get out more. We could go to the country for weekends. Andrews wasn't listening. He was back at the window, staring out into the street again. I wish he'd go back to France and stay there, Andrews snapped out suddenly the next morning at breakfast. Who, dear? Said his wife. Oh, you mean Aaron Burr. Did you dream about him again? I don't see why you dream about him all the time. Don't you think you ought to take some luminal? No, said Andrews. I don't know. Last night he kept shoving Alexander around. Alexander? Hamilton. God knows I'm familiar enough with him to call him by his first name. He hides behind my coattails every night, or tries to. I was thinking we might go over to the old Drover's Inn this weekend, said Mrs. Andrews. You like it there. Hamilton has become not only my brother Walter, but practically every other guy I have ever liked, said Andrews. That's natural. Of course it is, she said. They got up from the table. I do wish you'd go to Dr. Fox. I'm going to the zoo, he said, and feed popcorn to the rhinoceros. That makes things seem right for a little while, anyway. It was 2 nights later, at 5 o'clock in the morning, that Andrews bumbled into his wife's bedroom in pajamas and bare feet, his hair in his eyes wild. He got him, he croaked. He got him. The bastard got him. Alexander fired into the air. He fired in the air and smiled at him, just like Walter. And that fiend from hell took deliberate aim. I saw him take deliberate aim. He killed him in cold blood, the foul scum. Mrs. Andrews, not quite awake, was fumbling in the box containing the Nambutal, while her husband ranted on. She made him take 2 of the little capsules between his sobs. Andrews didn't want to go see Dr. Fox, but he went to humor his wife. Dr. Fox leaned back in his swivel chair behind his desk and looked at Andrews. Now, just what seems to be the trouble, he asked. Nothing seems to be the trouble, said Andrews. The doctor looked at Mrs. Andrews. He has nightmares, she said. You look a little underweight, perhaps, said the doctor. Are you eating well, getting enough exercise? I'm not underweight, said Andrews. I eat the way I always have and get the same exercise. At this, Mrs. Andrews sat straighter in her chair and began to talk, while her husband lighted a cigarette. You see, I think he's worried about something, she said, because he always has this same dream. It's about his brother Walter, who was killed in a cemetery by a drunken man, only it isn't really about him. The doctor did the best he could with this information. He cleared his throat, tapped on the glass top of his desk with the fingers of his right hand, and said, Very few people are actually killed in cemeteries. Andrews stared at the doctor coldly and said nothing. I wonder if you would mind stepping into the next room, the doctor said to him. Well, I hope you're satisfied, Andrews snapped at his wife as they left the doctor's office a half hour later. You heard what he said. There's nothing the matter with me at all. I'm glad your heart is so fine, she told him. He said it was fine, you know. Sure, said Andrews, it's fine. Everything's fine. They got into a cab and drove home in silence. I was just thinking, said Mrs. Andrews as the cab stopped in front of their apartment building. I was just thinking that now that Alexander Hamilton is dead, you won't see anything more of Aaron Burr. The cab driver, who was handing Andrews change for a $1 bill, dropped a quarter on the floor. Mrs. Andrews was wrong. Aaron Burr did not depart from her husband's dreams. Andrews said nothing about it for several mornings, but she could tell. He brooded over his breakfast, did not answer any of her questions, and jumped in his chair if she dropped a knife or spoon. "Are you still dreaming about that man?" she asked him finally. "I wish I hadn't told you about it," he said. "Forget it, will you?" "I can't forget it with you going on this way," she said. "I think you ought to see a psychiatrist." "What does he do now?" "What does who do now?" Andrews asked. "Aaron Burr," she said. "I don't see why he keeps coming into your dreams now." Andrews finished his coffee and stood up. "He goes around bragging that he did it with his eyes closed," he snarled. "He says he didn't even look. He claims he can hit the ace of spades at 30 paces blindfolded. Furthermore, since you asked what he does, he jostles me at parties now." Mrs. Andrews stood up, too, and put her hand on her husband's shoulder. "I think you should stay out of this, Harry," she said. "It wasn't any business of yours anyway, and it happened so long ago." "I'm not getting into anything," said Andrews, his voice rising to a shout. "It's getting into me. Can't you see that?" "I see that I've got to get you away from here," she said. "Maybe if you slept someplace else for a few nights, you wouldn't dream about him any more. Let's go to the country tomorrow. Let's go to the Lime Rock Lodge." Andrews stood for a long while without answering her. "Why can't we go and visit the Crowleys?" he said finally. "They live in the country. Bob has a pistol, and we could do a little target shooting." "What do you want to shoot a pistol for?" she asked quickly. "I should think you'd want to get away from that." "Yeah," he said, "sure." And there was a far-off look in his eyes. "Sure." When they drove into the driveway of the Crowleys' house, several miles north of New Milford, late the next afternoon, Andrews was whistling Bye Bye Blackbird. Mrs. Andrews sighed contentedly, and then, as her husband stopped the car, she began looking around wildly. "My bag!" she cried. "Did I forget to bring my bag?" He laughed his old normal laugh for the first time in many days as he found the bag and handed it to her. And then, for the first time in many days, he leaned over and kissed her. The Crowleys came out of the house and engulfed their guests in questions and exclamations. "How have you been?" said Bob Crowley to Andrews, heartily putting an arm around his shoulder. "Never better," said Andrews. "Never better. Boy, is it good to be here." They were swept into the house to a shakerful of Bob Crowley's icy martinis. Mrs. Andrews stole a happy glance over the edge of her glass at her husband's relaxed face. When Mrs. Andrews awoke the next morning, her husband lay rigidly on his back in the bed next to hers, staring at the ceiling. "Oh, God," said Mrs. Andrews. Andrews didn't move his head. "One Henry Andrews, an architect," he said suddenly in a mocking tone. "One Henry Andrews, an architect." "What's the matter, Harry?" she asked. "Why don't you go back to sleep? It's only 8 o'clock. "That's what he calls me," shouted Andrews. "One Henry Andrews, an architect," he keeps saying in his nasty little sneering voice. "One Henry Andrews, an architect." "Please don't yell," said Mrs. Andrews. "You'll wake the whole house. It's early. People want to sleep." Andrews lowered his voice a little. "I'm beneath him," he snarled. "I'm just anybody. I'm a man in a gray suit. 'Be on your good behavior, my good man,' he says to me, 'or I shall have one of my lackeys give you a taste of the riding crop.'" Mrs. Andrews sat up in bed. "Why should he say that to you?" she asked. "He wasn't such a great man, was he? I mean, didn't he try to sell Louisiana to the French or something behind Washington's back?" "He was a scoundrel," said Andrews, "but a very brilliant mind."